Walking the plank. It's a phrase that has been closely associated with pirates for hundreds of years, lending itself to countless pop culture references, literature of historical fact and fiction, and even the name of this YouTube channel. But where does the phrase come from? Did pirates really make their captives walk the plank to a sure and grim, watery grave? Or like many other pieces of pirate culture, was it hauled up from the depths of fiction over the years? In today's video, we will be giving you a rundown of exactly what this iconic pirate punishment involved. We will firstly examine what walking the plank actually refers to, examining the horrors of this particularly cruel and unusual method of dealing with insubordinate pirates. Following this, we will be taking a look at the facts behind walking the plank, examining the rare historical resources that deal with the subject. We will also be discovering the literary prominence of the phrase, discussing how authors, directors, and artists have brought walking the plank to the forefront of our perceptions on Golden Age pirates. Finally, we will round off with a look at the most common of pirate torture and punishment methods, some of which were fates you wouldn't wish upon your worst enemy. Sit back and relax as we take you back to the Golden Age of piracy to discover what walking the plank really was and where the phrase came from. Welcome to Walk the Plank. What was walking the plank? Before we examine the historical accuracies and inaccuracies of the phrase, let's recap on what walking the plank actually was. Said to be a method of torture, or more often than not execution, practiced by maritime criminals across the Golden Age of piracy, walking the plank is a phrase that has become almost symbiotic with Golden Age pirates, mutineers, marauders, and privateers operating in the waters of the Caribbean. It paints these men in an incredibly sadistic light and has gone down in history as one of the least desirable and most terrifying execution methods ever practiced. The punishment is said to have often taken place as follows. An offender, possibly an insubordinate pirate, the captain of a captured ship, an ousted pirate leader, or an otherwise condemned pirate enemy, would be tied up with rope to the point where the use of their arms and legs was impossible, or at the least highly restricted. The condemned man would then be forced to watch as the rest of the crew extended a wooden board, the plank, out over the side of the ship. While the crew held it steady at one end, the condemned would then be forced at knife or gunpoint to walk along the length of the plank as the pirates threatened and taunted them. Upon reaching the end of the wooden plank, the captive would be expected to jump into the rough waters below. Upon doing so, the ropes wrapped around their body would make swimming near enough impossible, and the unfortunate victim would often drown, unable to articulate themselves or keep their head above the surface. Walking the plank was designed to be just as much of a psychological torment as it was a physical one. As the pirates on board the ship watched and cheered as the condemned criminal was forced overboard, the victim would constantly be at the risk of the board snapping prematurely or being shot or stabbed if they didn't follow the captain's orders. Moreover, they would often be blindfolded throughout the ordeal, so if they took one misstep, they would easily fall to their doom. Combine these points with the fact that drowning is an incredibly stressful, highly painful way to lose your life, and you have a recipe for one of the worst torture and execution methods ever conceived by man. Walking the plank in reality. So now you know what walking the plank refers to and how it is typically said to be carried out, let's take a look at historical instances of the execution method being used on real-life pirates and their victims. The very first use of the word-for-word phrase walking the plank can be found in Francis Grosset's Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue, an encyclopedia of slang terms often associated with criminals. Walking the plank gets its very own entry in the dictionary where Grosset writes the following words, quote, "Walking the plank, a mode of destroying devoted persons or officers in a mutiny on shipboard, by blindfolding them and obliging them to walk on a plank laid over the ship's side. By this means, as the mutineers suppose, avoiding the penalty of murder." Now, at the time Grosset wrote his dictionary, the Golden Age of piracy was still relatively fresh in the minds of those living in the Caribbean and east coast of America. A little over 50 years had passed since the likes of Blackbeard and Black Bart were capturing ships and terrifying sailors of the local waters, and some pirates continued to operate beyond the end of the Golden Age too. This could possibly make it a reliable historical source, informing us that the execution method was indeed practiced out on the high sea by certain pirates. While this is the first recorded written account of pirates making their victims walk the plank, it is not the very first instance of such an event having taken place. That honor goes to a man by the name of George Wood, a mutineer but not a pirate, who turned on his commanding officers aboard his vessel in 1769 as a result of poor conditions aboard the ship. He was arrested and sent to Newgate Prison in London, where he would eventually confess to the chaplain that he and the others involved in the mutiny forced their officers to walk the plank. The law took this as an official confession, although there was some doubt on exactly how accurate Wood's claims were. The first instance of a pirate having been documented making his crew walk the plank was the case of John Dordrecht, a Danish captain otherwise known as John of the Baltic, who, as you might expect, operated in the Baltic Sea. He did this in the late 1700s, rumoured to have defeated Russian warships and taken them under his own control to amass a fleet of pirate vessels. Not only was Dordrecht a successful pirate, he was also reportedly a particularly brutal one. There are several accounts of the captain personally killing his victims, stabbing and shooting his way to the top. What makes Dordrecht stand out, however, is the fact that he is one of the only pirates who is thought to have frequently exercised the use of making his victims walk the plank. Like many pirates, however, there are some inconsistencies with his story, and many do not entirely believe it to its full extent. If true, this would make Dordrecht a great exception. Plank walking was typically reserved for special occasions on board pirate ships, and was not used lightly. Other historical accounts are commonplace across the coming years following the end of the 1700s, but detail on these specific incidents is fleeting at best. There are accounts of William Smith, a British naval captain, being captured by pirates operating a schooner known as Emmanuel in 1822. When the pirates overpowered Smith and his crew, they boarded his vessel and made him walk the plank off its side. He did not survive the encounter. The last documented instance of plank walking comes from 1829, when the Dutch brig Van Frederica was attacked by the pirates off the coast of the British Virgin Islands. Very little information is available as to how the encounter took place, but the pirates quickly overpowered the crew and boarded their ship. The terrified crew were, to their horror, ordered to walk the plank into the rough seas below, but the pirates had one last cruel surprise in store for them before they did. Not only were they tied up, but cannonballs were attached to their bodies as they walked the plank. This gave them no chance of survival, as the immense weight tethered their lifeless bodies to the seafloor for years to come. Any instances of walking the plank that followed these historical accounts typically involves pirates forcing each other to carry out the terrifying execution method. Several mutineers or insubordinate pirates met their end this way, and such cruelties were no longer performed on captured sailors. Walking the plank in fiction. So, in a historical sense, walking the plank was a punishment that was reserved for special occasions or particularly sadistic pirate captains. Why then is it so commonly associated with pirates in popular culture and our depictions of them? That, as we will shortly find out, is all down to pirate-themed literature. As usual, perhaps the most common depiction of walking the plank in popular media comes from our favourite Robert Louis Stevenson's 1884 novel, Treasure Island, a cultural classic and certainly a book that has fed more into pirate pop culture representations than anything else. Walking the plank is mentioned in the book from the very beginning of the novel, where stories are told of pirates making their victims walk the plank. Charles Johnson's 1724 book, A General History of the Pirates, commonly used as a historical resource for learning about the pirates of the Golden Age, yet one that may itself be a work of complete fiction, claims that walking the plank was an adaptation of walking the ladder. This ancient practice was said to originate in the ancient Mediterranean, where Roman slavers offered their captives the chance of freedom if they were able to walk to the end of the ladder and swim to shore unharmed. One of the most iconic depictions of the cruel and unusual practice of walking the plank in the modern age comes from J.M. Barrie's iconic novel Peter Pan, a book which was later adapted numerous times into animated and live-action films alike. In both the book and the subsequent films, the villainous Captain Hook is typically shown ordering captives to walk the plank into crocodile-infested waters, and this representation has resulted in, particularly in modern times, walking the plank becoming a perceived commonplace practice in pirate life. This has been further bolstered by depictions of the grisly execution method having been featured in the Pirates of the Caribbean film franchise, where multiple characters are ordered to walk the plank by pirate captains. Marooning. Just because pirates didn't commonly practice plank walking amongst their victims does not mean that they shied away from horrific torture and executions. One of the most common methods of dealing with an insubordinate pirate or a treacherous leader was to maroon them, essentially leaving them in a place that they cannot escape. Usually, these places were desert islands void of any features and surrounded by deep, often rough waters. Occasionally, pirates would abandon their ex-captains after a mutiny on exposed sandbars or spits, which would then be enveloped by the waves at high tide, taking the doomed pirate out to sea. What makes this execution method even more grisly is the fact that pirates would provide the marooned victim with a package, usually containing 3 items: a serving of food, a bottle of water, and a pistol loaded with a single bullet. The gun, of course, was so the pirate could opt to take their own life should they choose to suffer a quick death. The food and water acted as a sort of last meal, or was intended for pirates who desired to attempt a second chance at living. Marooning was, as you might expect, fatal more often than not, and only a few select pirates managed to make it out alive. Marooning was so rife in the 17th and 18th centuries, in fact, that pirates were often referred to as marooners by those living on land. One pirate captain who was able to escape the clutches of the desert island he was marooned on was Edward England, a pirate of Irish origin who was known for his unusual compassion and kindness as he operated in the waters of southern Africa in the 710s. England would eventually find himself at the hands of mutineers upon rising to power as a pirate captain, and he and 3 of his men were marooned on the island of Mauritius. Unlike many captains, they were not provided with enough food and water to last them more than a few days, and they soon realized they had to act fast. England and his men scavenged any resources they could on the island for 4 months, hunting local wildlife and drinking from rivers. Once they had established something of a foothold on the island, they set to work on making a raft that could take them to the nearest port. 4 months after their marooning, they boarded the raft and set sail for St. Augustine's Bay in what is today Madagascar. At the time, it was a known pirate haven, and England was able to temporarily rebuild his career before he died from a tropical disease in 1721. All 4 of the men managed to make it back to Madagascar in one piece after their marooning, however. Outro. So that is the story of walking the plank in all its horrific glory. Unlike many of the stereotypes introduced in popular media such as Treasure Island, walking the plank was indeed a real practice and pirates did take part in it. Surely it must have been a truly awful way to go. Fortunately, this practice started to die a gradual death with the golden age of piracy, and pirate crews started to phase out its usage on board their ships. Today, it is a long gone thing of the past. Amidst all its horrors, walking the plank has provided us with some of the most important popular culture references surrounding pirates in the modern day. It is hard to observe any pirate literature or screen media without encountering some sort of reference to walking the plank, and it is no doubt a phrase and practice that has kept the pirate's life alive and well in our imaginations. Thank you for watching this episode all about walking the plank on Walk the Plank. Please do subscribe if you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next week for another video. Have a great week. Cheers.